David Suzuki joins me in the studio. I want to ask you first, you've described our consumption of genetically modified food as a massive experiment. That's what science is about, experiments. What's your primary concern about this one?
Well, the point I make is that we have no idea what the long-term consequences of these genetic manipulations will be on the public. There is no way that our health authorities can test all possible combinations and permutations over a large enough population over a long enough period to be able to say with a surety that they're harmless. So basically, by slipping it into our food without our knowledge, without any indication that there are genetically modified organisms in our food, we are now unwittingly part of a massive experiment. Over years, as thousands and thousands of people continue to consume this, we will provide the data which will allow us ultimately to conclude whether or not there's any danger.
In improving the foods that it has, Health Canada says that they've looked for toxins and allergens, but that essentially at the end of it, a potato is a potato, and if it doesn't have either one of those things in it, it's safe.
Yes.
Why isn't it?
Well, essentially, the U.S. FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has said that genetically modified organisms or food are basically not much different from regular food, and so they'll be treated in the same way. The problem is this. Geneticists follow the inheritance of genes in what we call a vertical fashion. You breed a male and a female, you follow their offspring, you breed them, you follow it on down, within a species. What biotechnology allows us to do is to take genes from this organism and move it, what we call horizontally, into a totally unrelated species. Now, David Suzuki doesn't normally mate with a carrot plant and exchange genes. What biotechnology allows us to do is to switch genes from one to the other without regard to the biological constraints.
Now, I mean, you're a geneticist. You know this field better than any of us. Why is that of particular concern?
Well, the problem is this. You see, it's very, very bad science. We assume that the principles governing the inheritance of genes vertically applies when you move genes laterally or horizontally. There's absolutely no reason to make that conclusion. We've got to do much more experimentation.
And yet we're dealing with such small bits.
Oh, sure. But one of those small bits can determine the difference between whether you're, in a human being, a mutation can determine whether you're crippled or you die. I mean, because they're tiny, a tiny part of it doesn't mean they are not potent. And the point is, when you move a gene, one tiny gene, as you say, out of this organism into a different one, you change completely its context. And there is no way at the present time that we can predict how that's going to behave and what the outcome will be. We think that we're designing these life forms, but it's like taking the Toronto Symphony Orchestra prepared to play a Beethoven symphony, and then you take some taiko drummers over here and you flip them over in with the Toronto Symphony and you say, play music. Well, what comes out is going to be something very, very different from either the taiko drums by themselves or the symphony.
Presumably this science is well motivated. They're doing this for the right reasons, whether they say it's to reduce the use of pesticides, to be able to improve crop yields, to be able to, I suppose, fight pests and bugs in our foods in other ways. What's the answer? I mean,
well, that's what the publicists say, is that it's being driven for all of these good things. The fact of the matter is it's being driven by money. Tremendous amount of money, speculative money, invested in biotech companies now, and so there's a tremendous amount of pressure to realize some kind of income on that investment so you can have some real economic exchange here. So it's money that's driving it. You know, they say that it's to help deal with the huge population growth. Well, Wolfenson, the president of the World Bank, says that 1.3 billion human beings live on less than $1 a day. 3 billion people, half the human population, lives on less than $3 a day. Do you think they're going to be able to afford the very expensive genetically engineered foods? A great deal, more than half of the products, say, of Monsanto, are seeds that are generated not to produce more nourishment or to be better tasting, but to allow these plants to be drenched with Monsanto pesticides. Normally, those pesticides would kill the grain or the crop, but now they've engineered them to be resistant to those, and they demand to have the Monsanto product put on them. So it's a business excuse. It has nothing to do with improving the quality of life on Earth.
So what should consumers do? What do you do?
Well, I personally think it's too late to put the genie back in the bottle. It's already on us. And so to demand that a stop to all of this and a moratorium be held is really pretty unrealistic. At the very least, in a democratic society, in a civil society, we as consumers ought to be given the choice whether we do or do not want to become part of this massive experiment. So at the very least, surely you could put on the label whether or not there are genetically modified organisms in it.
Has it changed the way you eat?
Definitely. Well, I mean, I've never gone for eating GMOs. I'm alarmed because so much of it has been slipped into our food without any public discussion or awareness. And it's not just in the food you and I eat. Our children are getting it in the various children's foods. And now I see there's a move for Gerber's and Heinz to get away from GMOs in children's foods. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. We've never been given the choice. Now I say it's time at least to give us that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.